us again. It's the second time here. And we invited you to talk. Inflation is burdening everybody. We were not prepared for that. We were expecting the pandemic to have a wonderful world waiting for us, and we are living in a kind of nightmare. So you research a lot of central banks and monetary policy. Can you tell us more about the relationship about inflation and the choices of monetary policy and what we can do to fight against this?
Well, let me begin by saying thank you very much for inviting me. I was in this room 4 years ago.
It's 4.
4 years ago. And I'm very happy to be back. It's always a pleasure. It's a wonderful city and such wonderful people here at the university. So thank you very much. So inflation and central banks. You know, you're right, inflation all over the world, nearing double digits. In Canada, it's close to 9%. In the United States as well. And during all of this time, policymakers fell back on a very sort of traditional way of understanding inflation and of fighting inflation, which is by raising interest rates. So this has been the traditional way, call it mainstream way of fighting inflation. And the idea is that if you raise interest rates, that will lower demand, consumption, investment, which should slow down inflation and bring it back down. That's the theory. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problems with this view, both in terms of theory and in terms of empirical analysis. I am prepared to say that this view is wrong, and that central banking or monetary policy is perhaps not the best way of fighting inflation because it inflicts too much damage on the economy. That when you fight inflation using interest rates, and I'll get into the reasons why, it ends up creating a lot of unemployment, which then shifts the burden of fighting inflation on the backs of workers. And for me, that's a problem. And so I think there are better ways of fighting inflation, which I'll get into, but it relies on the use of fiscal policy. So when I mentioned the mainstream view, there are two components to that approach. There's a policy component, which is the use of the interest rate in fine-tuning. You know, a lot of the people here and who are listening are probably too young, but I see a couple of older people who will remember those radios. Yes, those radios. You know, when you turn the knob a bit to the left, a bit to the right, to get the right frequency. And so this is what central banks do. They have an inflation target of 2%, or depending on which country, and 3 or 4%. And then they use interest rates, a little bit high, a little bit low, until inflation comes back down to target. So in Canada, where I am, the target is 2%. And inflation is more than 8%. So the idea is you crank up interest rates in order to bring inflation down. And they've done that. A few weeks ago, the Bank of Canada increased the interest rate by 1 whole point, by 100 basis points. And so that was quite a dramatic and very aggressive way of responding. It was, if memory serves right, the most aggressive increase in monetary policy in the last 6 months since 1990, so in the last 30 years. So central banks, and again in the United States, They increase interest rates twice now by 75 basis points. So they're being very aggressive. Not so much in Europe, but they're getting there. They'll have no choice. They're going to have to start raising interest rates. And you've seen in Europe the fact that they haven't been as aggressive with monetary policy. The euro has lost a lot of value, 30% or so of its values, 20, in that ballpark. So they're going to start raising rates. Now, that's, like I said, the monetary policy component of that model, that approach. The second component is what's called the transmission mechanism. How do these changes in interest rates affect the economy, which then gives you your desired inflation? And so, like I said, you change that interest rate, because central banks can manipulate interest rates. Even in Brazil, central bank can have any interest rate it wants. It may have consequences on your exchange rate, for example, but that's another question. Central banks can control interest rates at whatever level they want, and that it might have consequences. And those consequences is this transmission mechanism.
We can see that here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the idea is that you change your interest rates in order to affect demand. Because it is believed that inflation is caused by demand. And in this sense, what the model, or what those people who believe in this model say, is that after the pandemic, when the pandemic had a tremendous impact on savings, because we couldn't go to restaurants, we couldn't go to bars, we couldn't spend our money. So it led to a lot of accumulated savings. And when the pandemic ended, people started spending again. And there's your demand, and it raises prices. On top of that, in the United States and Canada, there was a tremendous spending by governments. Deficits increased manyfold, and that led to pent-up demand, and that led to increased prices. So that's the story that we hear. And so that model of interest rates, or that model of using interest rates to bring inflation down, to fight inflation, only works if inflation is caused by demand. So what we need to understand as economists and as political economists and social scientists is, what is the current cause of inflation? Now, I'm going to go on the record to say that most of the time, inflation is not caused by demand. Certainly not in the last 40 years. And it's very true now. If you look at the increase in wages, it has lagged behind growth rates, it has lagged behind inflation rates, so that wages, which is the main source of your consumption, is not catching up, is not keeping up with. So it's difficult to make a case that inflation is caused by excess consumption. There's that. And then on top of that, empirical evidence seems to suggest that inflation is caused essentially by gas, petrol, which is, the price of gas has been increasing a lot, mostly because of the war in Russia. There are signs that gas is coming down a little bit, but there's the second component is caused by bottlenecks, supply chains. Factories having closed down for 2 years in China. The semiconductor industry, which is used in cars and virtually everything, well, there's a lack of those having been built. And so you see that a lot of the car industry has not been able to keep up with building cars. And then and other products. And then the third component of the current inflation seems to be, and this is a little bit more controversial, But there's a lot of empirical evidence in the US, at the Economic Policy Institute in Canada, at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and other places in Europe, notably, that a third important component of inflation right now is what we call profit greed. Companies increasing prices because they want, because they can, because they're taking advantage of the confusion of the situation in order to increase prices. Now, we have to understand that prices are not set by supply and demand. There's no market for cell phones or for ties. It's basically the company who sets the price.
Are they recovering the losses of the pandemic?
Well, maybe, but that's another issue. We all suffered losses during the pandemic. And so the idea, we can't, as workers, we can't increase our wages. We can't, but companies are just increasing prices in order, and there are some examples of some companies. Now, the New York Times published about a month and a half ago, published a number of names of companies in the United States that increased their prices with no underlying reasons, simply to take advantage of the situation. So we have had a lot of that, and so greed inflation or bottlenecks or supply chains inflation, the war, the gas, the oil, seems to be the three major contributing factors to current inflation. And like I said, there's some empirical evidence that this is the case. So if this is the case, then you have to wonder, why using interest rates? Why use interest rates? Increasing your interest rates won't solve the war in Russia. Increasing interest rates won't reopen factories in China or lead to increased production of semiconductor chips. Raising interest rates won't reduce corporate profits or won't lead to companies reducing their prices. In fact, there's evidence that increasing interest rates leads to inflation. Companies now facing higher costs of borrowing and will pass those costs on to consumers. We see rents increasing in a lot of big cities. In Toronto, renting an apartment is going up by 15% this year. And this is because the owners of these apartments and buildings, when they renew their mortgages, they face higher mortgage rates, so they pass on those costs to consumers. So I'm saying that, there's a lot of theoretical and empirical evidence that suggests that using interest rates to fight inflation is probably not the best way, and in fact may at least prevent inflation from coming down.
Can I be the devil part
Yes,
here?
of course.
People are connecting the inflation with the quantitative easing policies by the central bank. So they floated the economy with money, so now they need to recover high the interest rate. How can we answer to this argument?
Yeah. Well, quantitative easing was simply the transformation of one asset into another. So the central bank first buying from various banks and then from individuals a specific amount of assets, and in return they received cash. But evidence seems to suggest that cash went back into the financial markets. Okay. So it led certainly to financial inflation. We saw the stock market over the last 2 years go to incredible heights. And this, I think, is very true of quantitative easing. It led to financial inflation. I'm not convinced it led to product inflation.
Okay. This is the transmission mechanism
Yeah,
that you said.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so I have something to say about that, if I remember, about the relationship between monetary policy and income and wealth distribution, which is something I've been working on a lot in the last 5-6 years. So I think that there's some evidence that using interest rates may not be the best solution. Now, let's assume that inflation is caused by demand. Okay, let's assume that. There's still a question on whether interest rates is still the best way of addressing demand inflation. Now, like I said, the idea of using interest rates is that increased interest rates leads to diminished consumption and investment. That's the transmission mechanism. But empirical evidence, and this used to be advocated by people like myself some 10 years ago, post-Keynesians, who argued that consumption and especially investment are insensitive to incremental changes in interest rates. So increasing interest rates from 1 to 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 may not have a negative impact on inflation, on investment. Investments depends on more long-term views about profitability and et cetera. So the increase in interest rates may not even have an impact on demand unless the interest rate, like I said, you may not have responses to incremental changes to interest rates. But after a while, if you look at the history of monetary policy in the last 40 years, when central banks wanted to bring inflation down, they raised interest rates 10, 12 times, if not more. And so after, a tremendous increase, an accumulated, as opposed to incremental, an accumulated increase in interest rates, yes, that might just have an enormous impact on investment, and then consumption, and then unemployment and labor markets. But you have to collapse your economy in order to do that. Now, David McDonald in Canada, he's done a wonderful study, and he looked at the difference between soft landing and hard landing. Now, soft landing is when central banks increase interest rates, hoping that it won't cause too much unemployment and inflation will come down. That's a soft landing. But he's looked at the last 40 years, and he's concluded that, at least in Canada, this happened 0 times. Every time the central bank in Canada tried to fight inflation, it collapsed the economy into a hard landing with much higher unemployment as a result. And, I'm prepared to say that at least the same thing in the United States. And you don't have to have sort of a Volcker period, Volcker having been the governor of the central bank in the US Federal Reserve. You don't have to have, who raised interest rates to 20%. You don't have to have a Volcker, an extreme Volcker situation. But you need to, is my microphone down? Thank you. I suspected it was down because I think I went like this and I thought I had dislodged it. Apologies. Let's start over again. No. So you don't have to have a Volcker situation, but, raising your interest rate 10 times, I think is sufficient to collapse your economy. And you see that repeatedly in many countries.
Brazil, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yes, because in addition to that, you are very sensitive to your exchange rate and then the pass-through effects. So it just complicates the story even more. But the story is still the same because as inflation rises in places like Brazil, if you don't raise your interest rate, your exchange rate collapses, and then you have your pass-through effect, and your inflation goes back up.
Yes,
So
I
you
was
need-
about to ask you that.
So you need to increase your interest rate even more in order to protect your currency. And that has even more devastating effects on unemployment. So, I published a paper in a book in Spanish. Of course, I don't write Spanish, but they translated it, thank you. And it was called The Inherent Biases of Monetary Policy. And what I argued there is that when monetary policy is used, or when inflation is weaponized, you can see what I call the class bias of monetary policy. The fight against inflation is done on the backs of workers. So you asked at the beginning if I was left. There you go. And it's done on the backs of workers. It's done on the backs of creating unemployment because you believe that that inflation is caused by unemployment being too low and hence aggregate demand being too high. So there's an admission in this model that the way to fight inflation is to get more people unemployed. And you see these admissions even coming out of Jerome Powell, right? So they're keenly aware that this is really what happens. So there's a class bias on two fronts. One, you create unemployment. And second, as you raise interest rates, you're increasing the rate of return on bonds. So those who own bonds are making more profits, or more revenues, I should say, out of holding bonds. And this is what John Smith, a Canadian economist, called the revenge of the rentier class. So you create unemployment and you satisfy rentiers, because part of monetary policy has two sides. If you remember the movie, again, maybe the audience is too young, the Indiana Jones, the first one, and they, when Indy Jones says, they didn't have the other half of the medallion, they're digging at the wrong place. Well, that's what monetary policy is. If you look at monetary policy only as a cost of borrowing, cost of lending, you forget the other side of that medallion, which is monetary policy is a revenue for people who hold bonds. And when you look at it from that point, and this is something that's, sometimes discussed by some people, Claudio Borio, chief economist at the Bank for International Settlement, right? So with quantitative easing, you have more and more discussion of the income distributive effects between workers and rentiers. So it's no longer sort of a fringe left argument. It's very much in the mainstream. And for example, I am organizing a conference on this topic, on income distribution and monetary policy, with the Bank of Italy. There's no more mainstream than a central bank. And, the Bank of England did a symposium on this topic, and other central banks. So, it is becoming a point of discussion. And so that's the other side of that medallion, is seeing monetary policy as a revenue. And that brings up the issue of class conflict, income distribution. There's a governor of the central bank at the Federal Reserve who called it a reverse Robin Hood effect. Yes?
So in a country like Brazil, that has a huge inequality, it is dramatic, and deeper the inequalities, that what are you saying?
So if...
It's deeper, the inequality.
Yes.
So it's dramatic, because we have a huge inequality, but it is deeper, so it's the wrong choice anyway.
Yeah.
Doesn't fight inflation and deeper inequality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So there's a class biasness in the use of monetary policy. And then there's also a gender dimension. Because if you look at the impact of monetary policy on labor markets, it falls disproportionately on women. And if you look at who benefits, the wealth benefits from increased interest rates, it is mostly white men. So there's a gender dimension. So I've argued that there's a gender bias in the use of monetary policy. And I'm with the Monetary Policy Institute, we're coming out with a book on monetary policy and gender. And there's not a lot of research on this topic, very few. It was difficult to put a book together, but we succeeded with 10 chapters. And some people are looking at the effect. There's some wonderful people in Rio who is looking at monetary policy, exchange rates, and gender. And so it's not a topic of great debate, but I think the book is going to have an impact and will anchor and legitimize that area of research. That's what I'm hoping. So I think there's a gender dimension. And the third bias is an ecological bias, where when low interest rates may lead to, carbon-intensive industries over-investing. And so I think that, and Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, is now the UN appointee to look at the impact of monetary policy on the environment. So these are three areas that are becoming very much ingrained in some aspects of the mainstream that we need to develop. And it leads to a very different view on monetary policy, a very different approach to monetary policy. But this said, central banks are still, very much entrenched in this original model that I discussed. And if you read some of the literature coming out of some central banks, you'll see that, they're aware, of the limited aspects. Jerome Powell said, a lot of inflation is not caused by demand, but, And I think that it's this argument, it's this TINA argument. There is no alternative. They believe that, only monetary policy, it's the only credible model out there. But, I'm going to end by saying that, first of all, I'm writing a book on everything I've been talking about, and where I deconstruct in a lot of details all the elements of that model, in a lot more details that I discussed today. And the second part of the book is rebuilding sort of an approach to monetary policy, but also to inflation, where I think fiscal policy can have just as much impact or better on inflation than monetary policy without the social costs. And I think that if we turn to fiscal policy, I think that we can shift the burden of fighting inflation away from workers. There's an economist, a young woman economist in the United States, Weber. She came out with this public policy paper where she argues essentially this. And there are ways of, introducing some sort of price reforms, controls, right, in order to limit the increases in prices. Like I said, prices are exogenous. They are set by firms. And there's, maybe we should, I wouldn't go so far as to say that we have to, maybe an agency has to approve dramatic price increases of certain products. Maybe companies have to produce evidence that they need to increase prices. Maybe that's too dramatic a policy proposal. But there are other ways of controlling prices. In Germany, I was just in Germany, where they've reduced the price of public transit to €9 a month, and you have access to all trains, subways, trams. You can travel all around Germany for €9 a month. This is something, you can address the price of oil, right? You can release, right? You can build a buffer stock program of various raw materials, where when the prices start to increase, you release state-owned quantities of oil. The United States was trying to do that. So there are various ways through taxes. If companies have too much profits, that profit greed inflation, you can tax those extra profits at higher rates. So there's a lot of different ways. You have to sit down and figure out which policy can be used, but there are ways of doing it, and quite easy to think about those policies. But what is missing is the political will to do that. I think there's a lot of vested interest. There's a great book, if ever you want to pick up a book on central banks, by Clément Fortin and another Dietsch, and it's called "Do Central Banks Serve the People?" And it's a fantastic book written by an economist and sociologist. And they tackle the idea of independent central banks. And we're coming out with a book from the Policy Institute on central banks and central banking and democracy. So, which touches on these issues of social responsibility. But so much to talk about. Central banks are all over the news. But we need to really step back and understand what central banks do.
I have one more question.
Please.
Because when central banks raises the interest rate, also they have a path-through to the public debt.
Yes, yes.
So there is another component that we must look for. Because if you have a huge debt, you can't afford lowering the traffic jam, the tickets for the transport or everything else. So do you think this is another link?
Let me say that I disagree with you.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. But you're right. I think that one of the reasons interest rates were so low during the financial crisis and the pandemic was precisely to allow governments to spend and carry a very low debt burden.
Okay.
As interest rates increase, you are right, it's adding to the burden of the debt. Luis Jose Orrero just published, I created a blog a month ago or so, called The Monetary Blog, and we published a number, I think we've up to about 25 blog entries. And he just published the latest one in English, and we published also in Portuguese. And he argues that each half point increase in interest rates in Brazil leads to, I think he said, $16 billion, something like that.
That's it.
Don't quote my number. But the argument is it adds to the burden of the debt. Okay. So this is where I disagree. I agree, of course, it adds, because governments have to, sell more bonds, and that adds to the burden. Fine. But there's one lesson that we learned during the pandemic and also during the financial crisis. We have always been told in the last 40, 50 years, in Canada also, oh, we can't afford social housing. We can't afford more money for the homeless. We can't afford, various social programs. And we can't afford it, meaning there's a budget constraint on governments. And that famous Raynard and Rogoff paper that was discredited, they had put that ratio of deficit to GDP at 90%, or debt to GDP 90%. But even though the paper was, discredited, it's being cited again. But anyways, so the argument was that there's this budget constraints, and if you go beyond a certain level, it's going to be disastrous for the economy. So we can't afford social programs. But for some reason, we can afford lower taxes on the rich and corporations, under the assumption that they're going to create jobs, but it's rarely the case. But anyways, I digress. But what we found during the pandemic, especially during the pandemic, is that there are no budget constraints. The government increased in Canada deficits tenfold. Overnight, the Canadian government nationalized the workforce, paid for incomes of most Canadians, gave money away to corporations, to the airlines, and deficits ballooned in the United States as well. So what happened to the argument that we can't afford it? No, we can afford it. We can spend that money. There may or may not be consequences to that. But the argument is not that we can't afford it. Usually is we just don't want to afford. We just don't want to spend on social housing and homeless and free medicine, et cetera. Okay? So, but it does lead to increased burden. I agree, especially when we start raising interest rates. But I did say that that's the wrong policy. That you can, now interest rates are probably too low on a historical level, I granted, but they should maybe go up to more normalized levels. What that level is, I don't know. But there's no reason to use monetary policy to fight inflation. You can keep interest rates relatively low without having a burden on public policy, finances, and then use fiscal policy. For example, if you want to lower inflation in the future, now's the time to massively invest in green energy. I don't know why we're supporting a slowly dying oil industry. We should be going green. So the solution to control, because we know that inflation, a large component of inflation can be dictated by oil, right? The oil crisis in 73 and 79, for example, and today. Well, get rid of oil, reduce our dependency on oil. So massively increase spending. So you have to increase government spending in order to lower inflation in the future. We have to go green, and that's going to have a much higher impact on future inflation. The United States just created a massive public bank on the environment. And this is one aspect that's going to be studied a lot. The effect on, the relationship between environment and inflation. There's a book coming out that I'm editing we're coming out with about 12 books on monetary policy, on different aspects, on gender, on income distribution, on the environment, on social democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Financial stability, et cetera. So we have to start looking at that as a possible solution to inflation. Anyways, all of that to say, I prefer keeping interest rates fairly stable, fixed, at an acceptable level, and then fall back on fiscal policy as a way of controlling, limiting inflationary pressures.
What about international coordination between central banks? Because when United States raises his interest rate, our exchange rates goes up, so we almost have no choice. So,
but you know, I'm not a specialist on the Brazilian case, but I would argue that, like I said, you can have any interest rates you want. You don't have to follow the United States. In Canada, we don't always do that. But there may be consequences on the exchange rate. When the dollar in Canada went down to 65 cents to the dollar, it's now at about 85 cents, so it appreciated a lot. But the central bank was not that preoccupied about a low exchange rate. So in the case of Brazil, you know, I would say that there are fiscal ways of addressing exchange rate problems, you know, and that does not force you to rely on increasing interest rates whenever.
Like the single tool to solve everything.
Yeah. You know, it's what some 15 years ago, I published a paper on what I called monetary policy dominance. And I think I was one of the first to come up with that expression. And, you know, it's this idea that we think that monetary policy must be used. And it's a knee-jerk reaction. There's inflation, there's a problem with exchange rates, let's raise interest rates. And I think that we need to move away from that gut reaction and to start thinking in terms of fiscal policy to address some of these problems. And like I said, you know, if there's anyone here who wants to do a research on that, I think that's a very promising venue for students to look at, fiscal ways of addressing inflation and exchange rates. And there's some literature on it. And if you give me 10 minutes, I'll probably come up with some good papers in Brazil by Brazilian economists. You have some great economists here in Brazil who have worked on these questions. You know, some economists that I respect a lot have, you know, Bresser and Orero and Vernengo and, you know, a number of other great Brazilian equinomists have looked at these questions.
So thank you, Professor Rochon. Do you have time to tour
Yes,
questions?
absolutely.
So if you want to address a question.
It's not a question. It's just, I would like to know.
Does this microphone work now?
Hello. Yeah? Is it working? Okay, I'm Lucas. I'm a student of social science. I would like to know a bit more about the link that you make between gender policy, the gender trouble we have in our societies, with the monetary policy.
Yes. So, the two sides of that medallion, call it the monetary policy medallion, is that on the one side, interest rates are a cost. And on the other side, interest rates are a revenue. The cost side is that when interest rates go up, the argument is that eventually it will deflate your economy and you lead to labor market adjustments. Unemployment will go up. And you have to look at what are the industries that are most affected and whether these industries are more gender specific. And so if you have more women working in one industry, and that industry is more sensitive to monetary policy, then you have a gender effect. And the other component is the revenue side, where when interest rates go up or quantitative easing, and that leads to inflated asset prices, who holds those assets? You know, and this is one question that we're looking at in this book, and the preliminary evidence seems to indicate that it's mostly white men. So you have a gender, but also a racialized bias, right? So most black people, most women don't own large percentages of financial assets. It's men, it's white men. And so they benefit from quantitative easing. They benefit from increased stock markets, increased interest rates on bonds, okay? So that's the gender bias that I was talking about. And there's lots of work, and like I said, there's not a lot out there. There are some. Alyssa Brownstein has done some work on this, and a few others. James Hines at UMass Amherst has done some work on there. And anyways, but there's still a lot to do. And I'm happy that in this book, there's 2 Brazilian women who will look at specifically monetary policy and exchange rates and gender in Brazil. And I think that's going to be a very important contribution to the literature. There was a question over there.
The microphone and lapel is working.
It's working.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
I fixed it.
Hey, Professor, I'm also a social science. I'm studying social science also. Thank you for your presence. I have a question about the 3 main factors that you said about the causes of inflation. I noticed that all of them are not problems that we have here in Brazil. Those are problems from the international problems. And a great example of it is the oil market here in Brazil that is controlled by one single company, that is Petrobras, that is state company. And the oil prices here are high also, but our oil is extracted here in Brazil, and the price is affected by an international politics of the oil market. So basically, we are dependent on that politics of that international politics, and we could have a lower price if we didn't depend on it. And as we live in a globalized world, we are even more dependent on each other's countries. My question is, if this tendency of a globalized world and a dependent economy on each other is sustainable in the long term, and if not, how can we make an economy more sustainable? If, for example, we produce our consumption, and each one of the countries' products their consumptions, if we can make it more sustainable.
One of the conclusions from this pandemic has been how sensitive we are to these international linkages. You know, we know what happens when China breaks down, when the factories close down. It has global effects all over the world. And there are people who are starting to question how interdependent we've become to each other. And that, it worked well, relatively well, until, of course, you have a situation where everything breaks down, and that's when you realize that you have, it creates problems. There was talk, in Canada, we didn't have enough ventilators. We didn't have enough, we closed down our drug manufacturers, so we could not produce vaccines. We were dependent on other countries. And so there was talk briefly about the need to reassert ourselves in terms of national interests, industries that are, in the national interest. And so I think you're right that there are certain industries, and I'm not going, I would assume that that's more country specific. But I would certainly welcome less international dependencies, especially since, the argument for globalization was that it was supposed to raise all ships, all boats. Everyone, every country was supposed to benefit from globalization. And we know that that was not the case, right? Joseph Stiglitz wrote a very wonderful book called Globalization and Its Discontent, where he argues precisely this. Some countries made a lot of money, but other countries were completely exploited and were made worse off. So I think that there are some people who are rethinking globalization, rethinking international linkages, and the need for more self-autonomy. I would certainly welcome that. And again, it would be a country-by-country argument. What we need to do in Canada may not be appropriate for Brazil and vice versa.
Hi,
Women
Professor.
asking.
A
Good
women
night.
asking.
Yes,
so-
yes, yes.
My name is Fernanda. I graduated in international relations and I'm back to university. Earlier you said we should be looking for green energy, ESG, this kind of things. Once I was reading an article and said underdevelopment countries, they purchase their development that development countries had in the same way. And I know it was another time. They were not looking for ESG and this kind of things. But underdevelopment countries, they want to have this growth. What we should be doing as academic society for changes reality, to try to change this development and put some more ESG, more sustainable issues in discussion.
Look, it's a great question. The model for development says that the economic development of emerging or developing economies is based on sort of mimicking what's done in developed economies. The catch-up effect, or call it what you want. Now, I never sort of accepted that view. And I think that now, today, developing economies have an incredible opportunity of forging a different way towards development. And that is through green energy. And there is a tremendous impact, tremendous opportunity of really doing development differently. And be a leader in that area. Because what's going to happen if you do that, you're going to have developed economies trying to mimic you. Because I'm convinced that the path towards greater development is through green energy. And maybe this is what the Lula government is going to do soon. But, maybe. But definitely, you should encourage your government to follow that path of development, because it's not being developed all that much, right? There's this, if you look in the United States and you hear what's coming out of the, fake news industry, right? They all think it's fake news and everything. But, and it's difficult because you have so much vested interest against it. But I think it certainly is a different path to development. And I think it's a more promising path. Plus, you don't want to copy what's been done in the United States. God forbid, that's the last country you should turn to. Development over there, growth leads to massive inequality, massive problems. So and same thing for Canada and other countries. Probably not as much, hopefully not as much in Canada, but still the same problems. So the development model of developed economies should not be followed. That's, certainly a conclusion that anyone should be able to reach. I always tell my students, hey, economics is about figuring out how to pay for the society you want. If you want a society with a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty, a lot of homelessness, no health care, education that only the rich can afford, that's fine. Go live in the United States. But if you want a society where there's less inequality and people are more equal and women are treated better and racialized minorities are treated better and less discrimination and then national health care, and in Canada we're coming out with a national drug care. We have now in Canada national daycare. If you want a more egalitarian society, and these are the values that you find forms the basis of a great society, the just society, and that's great. Then let's figure out how to afford it. That's what economics is. That's what economics is. Economics should not be the end. It should be the beginning of a reflection on how to give ourselves the society we want. If you have too much discrimination, the rich are super rich. There was a time, if you look at the period between the 1930s, and let's stop thinking in terms of economic growth even. The objective of society should not be to generate 4 or 5% growth. The purpose of our economy should be to have less discrimination, better distribution of income. And if that leads to more growth, great. But growth should not be the leitmotif for policy. I want to live in a society that is more equitable, women are treated better, racialized minorities are treated better, indigenous people. Do you realize that in Canada, we built an arm for those space shuttles, we've contributed going to the moon, but we somehow can't have water on indigenous reserves. So, we have to figure out what we want in terms of society. And if it generates a little bit less growth, so be it. Because, a colleague of mine told me that the environment, it's over. Done. There's no turning back. That's it. We can't make it better. So, he's advocating spending more research on how do we build better homes? How do we deal with an ecology that's breaking down? So anyways, we have to figure out what kind of society we want. So, boy, that was like, but that's what I said, don't do the steps developed economies did because it led us to a dead end. Do it differently. Dare to think differently. Yeah.
Some question on the applause.
Okay, one more. The last question. Okay. One more.
Yes.
and we will finish.
Hi, I'm also a graduation student of social science, and you talked about right now how we should not follow the development
Yes.
countries like system of going green. So I would like to know if you have some ideas of how we should be going green.
I'm not an environmentalist, and I'm not going to say that I know a lot about it, but certainly in terms of energy, in terms of transportation, in terms, more emphasis on education, policies that reduce overconsumption, policies that controlled how products are being produced, how they're being discarded, how they're being, if you sit down 2 minutes with an environmentalist, they'll come up with a lot more ideas. But off the top of my head, transportation, energy, consumption, these are big issues. In Canada, baby steps, got rid of bags at grocery store, plastic bags. These are baby steps. But there's a lot more that we can do, a lot more. We got rid of plastic bags, but we still allow the sale of water in plastic bottles. So, we need a more radical approach to the environment. Because it's your future, it's not mine. I'm going to be dead in
You are.
10, 15 years, My niece has announced that she is not having babies. She's 25 because she doesn't want to raise babies in this climate. So, this is your future, not mine. And you're the ones who have to get involved and change things. And you're only limited by your imagination.
So you don't think there's any country that has a good administration of?
So I was asked this question recently, funny enough, and my answer was that I don't think there's any one country that is a big model, but I think there are different countries that have different policies. I was in Denmark recently, where the bike culture is enormous. I mentioned the German policy, of €9 a month for transportation. It led to, there was definitely a growth aspect because people were traveling to different cities, renting hotels, etc. But it led to a lot of people now using public transportation and less their cars. I think there are some policies around the world of how different countries do different things, but that's, again, would be a very good topic of study.
Thank you.
You need a green manifesto. That's what you need.
So, thank you very much, Professor Rochon.
Thank you very much.
We are very glad. And thank you for being here and participating in this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ok, eu toco em português now.
Yes.
Eu vou concluir. As escolas são espaços de debate. Então, não necessariamente o que nós falamos aqui reflete o que pensa a instituição, mas o que nós pensamos, acho que foi a participação de vocês muito rica, muito interessante. Queria agradecer mesmo a fala de vocês. Acho que cada uma dessas perguntas pode virar um projeto de iniciação científica sobre gênero, sobre energia limpa e principalmente sobre padrões de consumo. Tem na América Latina uma teoria sobre o bem viver, está na Constituição do Equador. Eu acho que responde um pouco a tua questão. Eu acho que há coisas muito interessantes para a gente pesquisar e publicar aqui na escola. A gente tem um material rico agora para refletir sobre. Eu queria agradecer profundamente a participação de vocês, a parceria do curso de CISO com o MPCC, para a gente poder promover esses debates, essas discussões, para a gente pensar um pouco desafiadoramente, não com aquilo que está colocado, mas com, enfim, outros argumentos. Muito bom ter vocês aqui. Obrigada.